Well, welcome everyone. I'm just noticing the chat coming through, and we've got people from all over Australia, plus New Zealand. So thank you everyone for coming on tonight. My name is Mary Burrell. I belong to the Rotary Club of Orange Daybreak, but I'm also the co-chair of the membership team for District 9705. Tonight is the very first forum that the membership team has been able to present for District 9705. This will be the first of many of these forums. Tonight we're going to be meeting Michael McQueen, an awesome speaker, and we're very proud to be bringing him to you. So tonight we have 181 people registered for this particular webinar, which is very, very exciting, the first of its kind, as I mentioned, that we've been able to do. So my role tonight will be to sit back, to watch, to enjoy Michael, and now to hand over to my co-chair, Judy Ford, who is in another part of Australia. Thanks, Judy.
Thanks, Mary. Good to see you, and good to know that so many people are watching this webinar tonight. I'm a member of Gungahlin Club, which is one of the Canberra clubs, and I'm really excited about tonight because this is a new thing that we've decided to do this year and have a monthly webinar of some sort, and we've got lots of good things lined up, as you'll hear later. But let's get on with it. I'm very, very pleased to pass over, and I just want to give you a little bit of a rundown about Michael in case you don't know him, although I think most people do. He's a multi-award winning speaker, trend forecaster and bestseller of author of 8 books. With clients including KPMG, Pepsi and Cisco, he has helped some of the world's most successful brands navigate disruption and maintain momentum. Michael is a regular commentator on TV and radio, and his work is featured in publications ranging from the UK Daily Mail to Medium.com and the Huffington Post. In addition, Michael is a familiar face on the international conference circuit, having shared the stage with the likes of Bill Gates, Dr. John Maxwell, and Apple co-founder Steve Wozniak. Michael has spoken to over 500,000 people across 5 continents since 2004 and is known for his engaging, entertaining and practical conference presentations. Having been recently named Australia's Keynote Speaker of the Year, Michael was inducted into the Professional Speakers Hall of Fame. So how lucky are we to have him here tonight? So over to you, Michael.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Mary, to Judy, to Paul, the rest of the crew who've pulled this together. And I just want to say congratulations. And this is what we're seeing right now in the Rotary world across the board is people just trying new stuff. And what you'd love to see is what happened behind the scenes before we just went live. There was a whole lot of challenges with technology, and it's like, how do we not get this right? And you know what? No one knows what they're doing right now. I think that's the encouraging thing is we're all willing to take a risk to try new stuff. And this is such a great case in point of that. So well done to you all for pulling this together. And here we are at the beginning of a new Rotary year in, I mean, probably what has been the most strange season for Rotary in all of its years of history. I mean, it's such a strange time in so many ways. And we're going to talk about this whole theme tonight of, as clubs and as leaders within clubs, how do we navigate this crisis well so we can come out the other end of it in a stronger position as clubs and as an organization. So that's the whole theme, this notion of how do we kickstart post-crisis. And I'm super mindful that we've got a spectrum even of those dialing in right now. I mean, if you're in Albury or any of that part of New South Wales or dialing in from Victoria, of course, you're back in lockdown and we're sorry for you. It is messy what's happening right now. If you're in New Zealand, I know we've got a couple of Kiwis tuned in. Good for you. And I hope you're having fun over there in the liberties and freedom of a post-COVID world. But we're going to talk about this whole thing of how do we navigate this crisis as we're in the midst of it for some of us, but also how do we come out the other end well. Now, the interesting thing about this whole virtual environment is that I try and picture, I guess, my audience, where they're at, what their setup is like, just because it sort of makes it a bit more personal, a bit more real. Interesting challenge with that, though, is that we're learning of recent times just how dicey that can get when you try and picture an audience in an online environment. Here is why. I saw this interesting research come through just a couple of days ago. I think you'll enjoy this. We discovered only a few days ago that only half of us, this was American data, but I suspect it is exactly the same here, half of us are actually wearing pants when we are working from home or dialing into webinars like this. which makes you then wonder, of course, what are the other half doing? If you wonder what the other half are doing, check this out. 22% say they wear pants most of the time. And we've got about 12% who say they sometimes wear pants, probably depending on the weather. I imagine right now a lot of people are because it's bloody cold. 5% rarely wear pants, but you know what's the most amazing here? 7% never ever wear pants while working from home and dialing into webinars. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands of who of you are tonight, those who aren't wearing pants. You know who you are, okay? But I'm going to encourage you to sit back, relax. We're going to go through a lot of material that's going to be hopefully really useful, very practical. I want to give you some things you can take back to your clubs. I'm mindful that in these sort of discussions, you tend to get those who are already on board. And so I want to arm you with some ideas, some questions, some thoughts to take back to your club so we can have this discussion about how we navigate the next few months really, really well. Now, just to get our heads in the zone, I want to kick off our time together with a bit of an exercise. I'm going to put up on the screen here behind me a series of 9 brands. Now, there are 3 things these 9 brands have in common. They're very different brands, very different industries. And as you look at this list of 9, I wonder if you can figure out what those 3 things they all have in common are. Okay, the first thing they've got in common is these are all brands that are very big. I mean, these are all brands that are in the Fortune 500. Second thing they've got in common is these are all brands that are old. In fact, 3 of these brands at least are over 110 years of age. Converse, GM, and IBM, 110 years plus. The third thing, though, that they've all got in common is this. These are brands and organizations that at some point faced a crisis so significant, it almost knocked them out of the game. I often refer to this group of 9 as the near-death 9, okay? And what I like to study from a research perspective, and I've studied this for a number of years now, is not what got them to the point of crisis, but what they did next. How did they navigate a challenging time well so when they came out the other side, they were in a position of strength? And a bit of backstory for those who maybe I haven't had a chance to connect with before. I've been in this space, for well over a decade now of tracking a data set of 200 brands and organizations, looking at this question of how do organizations and leaders behave or respond when a crisis or disruption hits. Now, why is it, for instance, that when disruption hits, some organizations, even though they take a hit, will actually bounce out of it well and often be stronger as a result of the experience, where others get knocked out of the game by that crisis? What's the difference between those 2 experiences? And what can we learn from those organizations that navigate crisis and disruption well? Because that's what we're all facing right now. And I want to suggest to you there are 4 things that every organization that navigates crisis well does differently, that they do well. And we're seeing this right now in different clubs. In fact, some clubs that in the midst of this crisis have actually pivoted. We've heard that word a lot, pivoted, adapted really quickly. Others that are still just a little bit listless and trying to find their way. So what are we seeing even in a Rotary world example? We're seeing the different experiences around how to respond to crisis. So I want to tell you that 4 things we're seeing come through in the research, 4 things that are essential if we're going to navigate the crisis well and come out the other side from a strong position. And if you have something to write notes with, maybe grab it out because we'll move pretty quickly here. First key is this. We need to think revolution, not just evolution when it comes to strategy for our clubs, but if you're in business as well, for businesses as well. I love even this language, this wordplay of revolution and evolution. I remember a few years ago speaking at one of the global assemblies, and John Hugo gave the opening address, and he shared a quote, and I hadn't heard this quote before. I thought it was so profound, and it was from our founder. Paul Harris put it well when he said this: if Rotary hopes to achieve its aims, it must be evolutionary always, and at times revolutionary. Now, I think we do the evolutionary change thing pretty well. But I think as an organization at some point, and you know what, most mature organizations do this, we get to the point where we forget how to be revolutionary and just how important being revolutionary is, particularly in a time of crisis. Now, one of the biggest dangers that we see organizations, the trap that organizations fall into over time, is they start to think of innovation and strategy as merely an exercise in continuous improvement, an evolutionary process. I love this insight from the former head of the business faculty at San Francisco University. Oren Harari said this. He said, remember, the electric light never came from the continuous improvement of candles. Isn't that great? I love it because it is so true. Like, it did not matter how good you got at making candles, how efficient that candle was, how long the light lasted, how pure the light was. There came a point where a fundamental rethink in how we made light needed to occur. Revolution needed to happen. And can I put it to you right now? That's what's required for so many organizations as we navigate this crisis. I mean, goodness, if we can't be revolutionary in the face of this crisis, what's going to be the catalyst to encourage us to do this? This is the opportunity for our clubs to do stuff that honestly 4 months ago, we would never have considered. I mean, I think of my own club. I'm a member at Crow's Nest Club in North Sydney, and we swapped to Zoom pretty early on. And I was thinking about it, honestly, 3 or 4 weeks in, some of our charter members, people in the 80s and 90s were saying, we're actually really enjoying Zoom meetings. Now, what's interesting is 2 years ago, I had a strategic planning discussion with our club around how we could change the way we did meetings. I suggested maybe we could use some Zoom meetings or using online as a platform. And it was just like complete brick wall. Like, no, we couldn't do that. That just, it wouldn't work. We've got to be together. It's all about fellowship. And yet here we are, our hand has been forced. I mean, necessity is the mother of invention for a good reason. And we've embraced a revolutionary thing that, again, wouldn't have even been possible, we thought, 6 months ago, and it's working beautifully. That's the place we're in right now. How do we use this as an opportunity to do the revolutionary things that actually we probably should have done years ago as an organization? And I think what I like to study is brands that do the revolutionary thing in the midst of crisis and how important that is. I mean, one that's a good example of this is the example of Amazon. Now, up on the screen behind me is a graph that if you're in business, you'd probably be fairly familiar with. We've talked a lot over the recent years about Amazon's meteoric rise in terms of their share price. Here's what's interesting though. If you look at Amazon's share price over time, it looks like it's been a fairly steady rise, incremental rise over time. And yet if you look at this window of time right here, and you actually just dial into that period of time, it's actually an incredibly tumultuous time for them as a business. In fact, for them, their first high watermark was actually in the late 90s when they had their first heyday. In fact, back in the late 90s, Time magazine produced what I would describe as the most creepy cover edition ever for Time magazine. And it was when they named Jeff Bezos the Time Person of the Year. So, I mean, Amazon, look how creepy that cover is. Okay, Amazon were having a good time in the late 90s. They were achieving massive success and prominence. Then, a few months after this magazine was released, the dot-com crash. And we saw in the space of 14 months, Amazon lose 90% of the company's value. Massive crisis. But what I find interesting is what Amazon did in the midst of that crisis. Because you know what most organizations do when crisis hits? We shrink back. We want to play a safe game. We just want to get through the crisis and then wait till things get back to normal, then we'll start rebuilding. And yet it's in the midst of the crisis, that is the most important time. In fact, in the midst of the crisis, that is when Amazon launched things like Amazon Marketplace. That massive overhaul of their business strategy. They went from seeing them as a single seller online to being a platform player for other providers. And if you think about it, that has completely recast the whole notion of e-commerce since. They also launched the early stages of Amazon Web Services, which, I mean, it had been an absolute game changer in the whole data space. What's interesting is they did make a few mistakes in this time period, and revolution is dangerous and dicey, and you tend to put a few steps wrong. This is also the time period where Amazon put a big bet on these things here, segways being the future of personal transportation. That didn't quite work out the way they hoped. And yet here's the thing, being revolutionary is so critical, particularly in the midst of a crisis, but it's hard. It's really hard. In fact, some of the best innovators on the planet have struggled to do this in recent years. I mean, Apple would be, like Amazon, one of the most innovative companies in the globe, and yet a few years ago, in the face of crisis, Apple struggled to be revolutionary. And the crisis for them was when we saw the launch of Spotify and Pandora. You know, Apple had, of course, revolutionized the whole music industry with the launch of iTunes, but then they got stuck. They got stuck in an assumption, a mindset which said customers shouldn't have to pay for the music they enjoy. Even if you just buy one song off the album, you should have to buy the whole album. And yes, of course, what did Spotify and Pandora come out with? They said, don't worry about paying for the songs. Just pay us a monthly fee and stream whatever you like, whenever you like. Now, put yourself in Apple's shoes. This is a massive disruption and crisis for your revenue model. And they basically tried to fight it. They didn't respond for 2 years. By the time Apple launched Apple Music, their own streaming service 2 years later, they were in a massive catch-up mode. In fact, this is the most recent data showing where Spotify are compared with Apple in terms of users. And that 2-year period where they delayed, where they struggled to be revolutionary, that cost them dearly. There's a key message in this. We've got to be willing to do the revolutionary stuff. And this time right now for our clubs, doing things that are uncomfortable, where there's risk, We are uncertain. We're way outside our comfort zone in terms of what we know how to do. And this is why I think, again, congratulations for doing this, because this is an example of that very principle in action. This is the time to do those very revolutionary out of the box things. My question for you is this, maybe pop this into the chat window there, because I've got an iPad here with the ability to just have a monitor of what's being said in chat. Question I want to challenge you to reflect on is this from a Rotary perspective. What are some of the biggest barriers, do you think, from your experience, to revolutionary thinking, to sort of taking the swings, to thinking outside the box the way that we've just talked about? What are the things that get in the way of us as Rotarians and our clubs being revolutionary? I'll give you a couple of moments. So fear of change from Rebecca. Hey, Rebecca, good to have you online. Hank said conservatism. I think you're right there. Anything else? Just pop a few things in from your own club perspective. What gets in the way of this? While you're doing that, welcome to the crew dialing in from Kenya. Great to have you online. The power and control model of leadership. Absolutely. Yeah, the concern of change being too fast. Tunnel vision comes up. I love Mel's response here because that's the way we've always done it. I'll come back to that theme shortly. You'll appreciate some of the things we'll share in that regard shortly. Yeah, and there's a few things coming through, very similar themes popping up. You know, the biggest thing we're seeing from the research that I guess goes to the core of why being revolutionary is so hard is we're often so unaware of the things we're actually doing. You know, we operate on autopilot. You know, we come to the same venue for the same club meeting, we sit in the same seats, we eat the same food. It becomes so habitual, so implicit to us, it's actually hard to step back far enough to think outside the box. This is an insight from a lecturer in the business faculty at Harvard. Rosbeth Moss-Cantor says this: habitual thinking is the enemy of innovation, particularly revolutionary innovation. Now, I'm going to just look at this for a few moments. This whole notion of operating on autopilot, habitual thinking. Look at how endemic that can be. So let's have a bit of fun for a moment. Grab out a piece of paper, if you've got one nearby you there, and I want you to do an exercise really quickly. Grab out that piece of paper. Now, I want you to list out every step that you go through to get in your car at home and drive to the end of your street. Every single step you go through to get in your car, drive to the end of your street, just list out all the things in chronological order, all the steps you go through, all the things you perform, the acts that you perform to get in your car, to turn it on, pull out of your driveway and drive to the end of your street. I want to give you just maybe 20 seconds or so. List out as many things as you possibly can. Give you another 15 seconds or so. All right, 10 seconds. 5 seconds. All right, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm going to put a list on the screen here of 9 things. Have a look at this list here for a moment. And I wonder how many of this list of 9 things it's possible that you missed in your discussion just then, on your list, sorry, on your paper. Now, the reality is I'm guessing most of you do most of those things every time you drive your car to the end of your street, but I'm guessing a number of you missed a good chunk of these. In fact, often when I'm working with live audiences, you'll have a few in any room that'll say, actually, I missed all 9 of them. Those are 9 things they actually do, but they do it so often, so unconsciously, that it's actually hard for them to step back and make what they do so unconsciously conscious enough to rethink it. That is the challenge we face right now, certainly in Rotary. If you've been around this organization for more than a few months or more than a few years, unless you're incredibly diligent or intentional, you are operating on autopilot. So before we get back into Rotary Club mode, I mean, once this crisis passes, we will meet again. We'll go back to something resembling what we knew before this. Let's use this opportunity to be revolutionary and evolutionary. There's a place for both. And there are 3 questions I want to challenge you to think about and to even have a discussion with your club about before we just go back into doing it the way we've always done it. Okay, this is a great opportunity for us to rethink things. I remember running this exercise with my club about 2 years ago, and it was fascinating, just some of the things that came out of the discussion. So I want to give you these 3 questions. We won't have time to discuss them in the chat function now, but just write them down, maybe take them back to your club and let this be a chance for starting some of these discussions. The first question is, let's step back from what we do every week and go, okay, what's one thing that we actually, if we're really honest about it, we need to stop doing? Actually, you know, this is something that we used to do that served a purpose, but actually now when we step back and think about it, we have this opportunity because of the crisis to stop operating on autopilot. We actually go, you know what, maybe that's no longer relevant or no longer necessary or no longer helpful. What are some of the things you need to stop doing? I mean, for our club, we realized as we listed out all the steps we go through as a club from beginning of meetings to the end of the meeting, about a third of that meeting didn't really serve a purpose. It was just stuff that we'd always done, sort of the traditions and the rote rituals and routines. And we canned a lot of it because we realized new members would come in and their first impression was all of our Rotary traditions at the beginning of the meeting. And I mean, by the time they got through the first 25 minutes of Rotary traditions, most of them were like, what is this place? They really didn't understand it, didn't want to be a part of it because it wasn't something they identified with. What we did is we swapped it all around. Firstly, we cut lots of those traditions out, the ones that weren't necessary. Some were, some weren't. But we put them at the end of the meeting. That way, people get a chance to get a feel for the organization. They get a chance to hear from a speaker and meet a few other members. Go, you know what, I get this place. I feel like I identify, I fit in here. And then you put all that stuff at the end of the meeting when they've already had that chance to build a first impression and a bit of connection with the club and with the organization. So, now what's one thing you need to stop doing? I love this insight here from the great Peter Drucker. There is nothing quite as useless as doing with great efficiency that which should not be done at all. Now, is it possible in our clubs, there are things we're doing very efficiently that actually we should have stopped doing years ago? Let's use this opportunity to actually ask some of those questions and have a really honest discussion about that. Second question is, what's one thing we need to start doing more of? You know, deliberately, intentionally. I mean, for us in our club, we realized we need to make more time for fellowship. You know, we often get to club meetings, we'd have so many of the traditions and routines, then a speaker, we'd actually never get a chance to really chat to each other. But that's the thing that made our club a beautiful place to be, is that the relationships. So we have to allow that more of those things. The third question might surprise you, because when we think about innovation, we often think about it as just doing new things, but that's not always the case. Third question I'd challenge you to ask yourselves and your club is this: what's one thing you should not have stopped doing? Because, you know, over time, what so often happens in organizations, things get complicated and busy, and over time, we actually start to forget doing the basics, the things that actually made us successful in the first place. In fact, go back to when your club was perhaps at its healthiest in terms of membership growth. What were you doing then that you've maybe stopped doing now? Is it time to go back to some of those things that were actually part of the secret sauce? Okay, so 3 questions again. I would challenge you to go back. Let's use this opportunity to be both revolutionary and evolutionary, to rethink the way we do things. Number 2, second key, if we're going to come out of this crisis well and use this crisis to our advantage as clubs, is this one here. We need to think possibility, not precedence. Think about how could we do things? What could our clubs be? What could our organization be? Not just relying on what always has been, not just in terms of traditions, but even our very ethos as a club. Now, speaking about how good we are at precedence, I remember I was on the strategic planning committee for Rotary International for about 2 years. And so every quarter I'd go to Evanston, and there were about a group of 10 of us who would sit down and we hammered out the vision statement, for instance, that many of you would now know was part of that group that formed that vision statement. What was interesting though in that strategic planning committee was spending a lot of time talking about this issue of how easily we just slip into that traditional precedent mode as an organization. And one of the committee members brought to one of the committee meetings this great video that he'd come across from the Lions Club group in the US. And I love this because the Lions Club had produced this video to poke a bit of fun at themselves. But as you watch this video in a few moments, I wonder how much this sort of reflects what we often do in Rotary as well. Have a quick look up on the screen here.
You enjoying your first pancake breakfast?
Oh, it's delicious. Thanks, Lion Carissa. Hey, guys, listen, I know I'm a new member, but I had an idea.
Okay, do tell.
What if we also served waffles?
Waffles? Lions eat pancakes. Always have, always will.
Do you want to lose your pen?
No, pancakes are the champion of the breakfast table. They're the only food worthy of the king of the jungle. Well, it might be nice to have a little variety, right? I mean, hey, look, we have syrup, we have butter in the back, and I actually carry a waffle iron in my hatchback.
You remind me of this guy who tried to bring French toast to the group. French toast Dennis.
Yeah, we don't talk about FTD anymore.
R.I.P. FTD. Oh, yeah, he didn't die. But he's dead to us.
Hashtag.
Lions pride.
Look, I know that being a lion is all about following tradition, but I'm just saying, what if we made our own traditions, you know, shook things up a little bit? Like what if we served grapes?
No.
Or a quiche? What if we had dinner for breakfast? It's very clear. Pancakes in the morning, spaghetti at night, everything in Lions Club will be all right. It's there in the bylaws.
No, it
isn't.
It should be.
Sorry for going against the group here,
Understood.
right?
Of
Yes,
No big deal.
I brought a salad for myself. I hope that's okay.
Absolutely.
It's not Rabbit's Club. Eat your pancakes.
Do you want some syrup?
No, thank you.
Do you want syrup?
Yes, I
There
would
it
love some
is.
syrup. Thank you.
Fine.
Now, again, it's easy to look at that and sort of laugh. And I love that the Lions Club, again, produced this of themselves, about themselves. Is it possible we do the same sort of thing, though? I think if we're really honest, we can fall into the same traps as an organisation and in our clubs. Now, what I find most interesting looking at that video is the perspective of that new member. And my question for you in your club, how open are you to the perspective, the insights, the ideas of our newest members, or even those who aren't members, but are just people from outside the club? Because I want to put it to you, when it comes to innovation, their perspectives, the perspectives of those with fresh eyes, are probably the most important. Why? Because people with fresh eyes, the brand new person, or maybe the speaker who comes into a club, or maybe even some of your own kids, get some of your kids to come along to a meeting at some point once we're gathering again face to face and go, you know what, can you just tell me, what do we do that seems weird to you, that doesn't make sense to you? And then listen. Don't get defensive, listen. Because what's interesting is that fresh eyes perspective, that's where some of the most powerful innovations will come. Why? Because people with fresh eyes don't know how we've always done it. No one's told them yet. I love this example of people with fresh eyes, thinking outside the box. In fact, I remember sharing this at the Sydney convention when I spoke there a few years ago. And I love this example of this student's exam response as a case in point of thinking outside the box and seeing things that all the experts had missed. And by the way, school teachers will tell you this is not called fresh eyes, this is called like smart ass, okay? But it makes the point. This ability to see things everyone else has missed. This is the opportunity we have. And I remember when I joined my club years ago, that was one of the things that, to their credit, my club was really open to. They said, come in and tell us, what are the things that as a new younger member don't make sense to you? And a few years in, I said, look, I think one of the things that we're doing that maybe could benefit from a little bit of updating is our barbecues. Like a lot of Rotary clubs, we have a barbecue at Bunnings, and we've been doing the same sort of barbecue setup for years. And when I first started doing the barbecues, what stood out to me is sort of, I don't know, and it's going to sound, I guess, mean, but it's not mean. It was really daggy, a daggy sort of setup, I thought. And I thought, we could really tighten that up from a branding perspective. It wouldn't take a lot. And it was interesting how the club sort of couldn't see it. So I said, okay, I'm going to go next time I'm on the barbecue roster and just take some photos as if I was a person walking up to our barbecue stand who had no idea what Rotary was about. What does it look like through their eyes? And so this is what our barbecue stand at that point looked like. So you had, the banner up here that would be many, many years old. It was actually held up by a number of coat hangers that had been wound into shape to hang off a drain pipe. Then, of course, you walk up to the table, and this is what the table had on it. It had, Rotary Down Under magazines, a whole lot of laminated posters. And when you look at just the volume of material on that table, when you've got a customer come up to buy a sausage at a sausage sizzle, you've got their attention for maybe 20, 25 seconds. I'm like, they can read maybe one thing. Let's make that one piece of information about who we are and why we exist simple, compelling. And yet, as you can see, there were just so many different things. We had about 3 or 4 different donation tins, some of which actually didn't tell you where the money went. It was just like, here's another donation tin. And I said, is it possible when people walk up and look at our club, they leave that barbecue table less clear on who Rotary is and what we're about than they were before we walked up? In fact, this is one of the banners that we'd put up. And you can just see just how many things. We've got a montage of photos. And I remember it was interesting. I actually said, one of the most troubling things to me about this poster is the fact that it says women welcome. Now that was done with the best of intentions, but I said, what, the reality is you look at anyone who's under the age of about 45, if they walk up and say women welcome, they'd be like, why is that even something that needs to be talked about? That almost raises suspicion if you have to spell it out that women are actually welcome. So fortunately, my club took it really well, and we said, okay, let's go back to the drawing board, and we actually redid our entire barbecue setup. And I must take some photos to show, because it's only simple, but it's all the new logos, the new branding. Went onto the branding site for RI, downloaded a whole lot of materials, and it didn't take much, but it just lifted really quickly. It was all about first impressions, but giving clear messaging on who we are and what we're about. Now, it's not just about branding. When it comes to leveraging fresh eyes perspectives, it's also about looking at what are we doing as clubs, and from a club experience perspective, they also may need a little bit of tightening up. In fact, when I'm working with corporate clients, the term that I often use when we discuss customer experience is this term of friction. And friction, if you're not familiar with it from an organizational perspective, that term, what it basically describes is the things that you do as an organization that affect the customer experience, that add complexity and frustration and bureaucracy and inefficiency. And like the barnacles that form on the hull of a boat, points of friction within an organization that build up over time, it's what slows you down. It's what weighs you down. It affects your efficiency. But the thing about friction we've got to be mindful of is the very friction that we're putting in place. That's what's turning away new members. And we've got to be so careful of not just going through what we do as a club, not realizing that we're actually adding things that are complicated or are barriers to entry for new members. I mean, for instance, how do we make new members sometimes feel confused, overwhelmed, not welcome by the very things we do as clubs? I mean, how many acronyms do you use in any given meeting? Honestly, in fact, nominate someone in your club to write down all the acronyms used in a club meeting. You'll be amazed how many come up, because that's what we do as clubs. We've got to be mindful. These are points of friction that can actually put new members off, make them feel unwelcome. I think the best business example I've come across is the value of trying to empathize with the customer or the marketplace, the customer experience, and identify the things that were causing friction. There's an example I came across from a colleague of this company over in the UK. So if you've been to the UK, you will have seen Costa coffee shops there on most corners, it seems. They're actually the second largest coffee chain behind Starbucks. The challenge is a few years ago, Costa Coffee, they'd found that their per store spend around the UK had stagnated or was going backwards. And all the executive team were trying to figure out why, why things stopped growing. Much like in many clubs, we've been talking for years in our districts about why is membership not growing in our clubs? And we've got a lot of theories about that. And they had a lot of theories about why their sales had declined or stagnated. But there was one executive on the team who was brand new to Costa. In fact, he had just come from working at Nike previous to this. So he came in with fresh eyes, different perspective. And he thought, okay, what's actually going on at the customer level? What are the things that maybe we don't know about that we need to address? So one day, instead of driving to head office, he drove into downtown London, sat himself inside the front door of one of Costa's busiest outlets, and he just watched customers come and go just to get a sense of what's the customer experience like in our cafes at the coalface. And he noticed something really quickly that surprised him. What he noticed is every fourth or fifth customer would come in, look around, turn around and walk straight back out the door, having not ordered anything. And he thought that was a bit odd at first, but when he kept seeing this happen time and time again, over the course of an hour and a half, he got so intrigued. He actually followed one of the customers who'd done this out the door, caught up with her outside just down the street and said, look, I'm not a stalker, I work for the company, but I've got a question. I noticed that you came in, looked around, turned around, walked back out, didn't buy anything. Now, what's that about? What are we missing? Now, what's interesting is back at head office, the theory was that the reason people weren't joining was because that the price of the coffee was too high or the range of the food was too limited. They had a whole lot of assumptions. What she said surprised him and everyone who heard it, because it had nothing to do with the price of coffee, the range of the food. What she said, and she actually got sort of embarrassed by this, her face all turned flushed and red. And she said, look, I actually love this cafe. I come here all the time. But she said, the problem is today I've got my laptop with me and it's almost out of battery. And because I know the cafe so well, I came in and I looked around and all the tables near PowerPoints were taken. So I realized that I have to go elsewhere for my coffee today. So he's like, wait. So if we had more PowerPoints, you would have stayed. And she said, yeah, for sure. I love this place. I love your coffee. I know all the staff here. And so he's walking back to the cafe thinking about what he's just heard. He walks into the cafe and speaks to the barista behind the counter. And I love this. He actually says to the barista, do you know we are losing customers because we haven't got enough PowerPoints in this place? And the barista said, oh yeah, that happens all the time. The barista knew. Who didn't know? Head office. Okay, and what was interesting about that is this guy took this insight back to his colleagues at head office, shared it with them. In the next 6 months, they doubled the number of PowerPoints and their per store spend surged 21%. That's a big number in a company that big. Now, I'm certain that wasn't all about PowerPoints. I'm sure other things happened too that influenced that result, but PowerPoints were part of the equation. And if not for trying to identify what was impacting the customer experience, that's something they would never have addressed, would never have known about, and it was a thing that was hampering their growth. And my question is, for you in your club, what's a little bit the same? In fact, when I went through this exercise with our club a few years ago, I said one of the things is that we actually don't allow for contactless transactions like tap and go to pay for, coming to pay for your meals or to have tap and go at our barbecues. Anyone under 30, most of them don't carry cash. And I said, if we don't have some ability to use a credit card, we're losing so many opportunities. And so we got one of those little square readers, and the difference that made straight away, because just to reduce that point of friction, made a big difference to how much we sold at our barbecues, but also young people just coming to meetings and paying, you know, to attend the meeting just with a tap and go on their card. Simple thing. But until we were aware of that point of friction, it was something that was actually getting in the way of people joining our club and engaging. Question I would ask you is this, in your own context. What are some of the precedents, some of the traditions, the ways of doing things that for you, if you actually step back from it, think may be getting in the way of you attracting and engaging new members right now? So I want to give you just 30 seconds or a minute, maybe just if you could pop into your chat function there. I'll just pick this up and have a quick look again. What are the things that get in the way, do you think, in your context of engaging new members? These things that are causing friction, perhaps these precedents, these traditions? I'll give you a few moments to enter those in. I love, Mary, your suggestion of having an acronym-free meeting. Find anyone who uses an acronym. I love that. Yeah, the sergeant session. I've got to tell you, that's one thing that our club got rid of. Made a big difference. It had turned from being a fun thing to being something that was actually a pain in the neck. Rituals generally, Mary said. Yeah, issues with Sergeant using inappropriate comments. Pete talked about grace. Again, that's something that we actually got rid of in our club. That sounds really mercenary, but we'd stopped saying grace because it had become, it didn't have any meaning as a tradition. It was just something that we did. And for people of faith, and I'm a person of faith, I'm like, you know, I remember saying to the club, I would be more offended if we said a grace that didn't mean anything than if we didn't say grace at all. And it was interesting, you know, we stopped saying grace, and it's just one of those things that, again, it was a barrier to entry or engaging new members. There's only a few come through. Look, I would leave this question with you. I would challenge you to go back to your clubs again, have this discussion. What are some of the things that, again, maybe get your kids involved. Get someone from your local community to come to your club and give them full permission. What are the things that we do? What are the precedents and traditions that we engage in that maybe right now are getting in the way? And then listen. It's amazing the things that will come up. Let's keep going. Number 3, and I'm only going to touch on number 3 really quickly. I undernote as to how much of this next point to put into the session, because we could probably spend an hour just talking about this theme if we had the time. And the third key, if we're going to emerge from this crisis, well, is to think tides, not waves. Now, this is an analogy that I often use, or a metaphor that I use when I'm describing the sort of trends we need to pay attention to. Because, you know, often what we do when we think about what are some of the trends and the technologies and the things that are changing that are most important for us to really tap into as organizations, sadly, we often focus on the waves, you know, the latest new thing that's come out. And waves at the beach are loud, they're hard to ignore, but their influence is only temporary. They come and they go. And yet tides are much slower moving, easier to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. But over time, tides will change the entire landscape. They'll change the shape of the beach. And right now, what I've been focusing on over the last few months is what are some of those tides? What are some of those trends that have been on the radar before this crisis emerged, that this crisis has sped up? Because right now for us as clubs, our challenge is how do we tap into those trends, the trends that are longer term trends that have been sped up by this crisis? Because when we emerge from this crisis in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is, we need to be ready to tap into where the world is up to at that point. This is our challenge and our opportunity. In fact, I heard a great quote recently that this crisis has meant the future has arrived ahead of schedule. A lot of those trends that were unfolding are now just happening a whole lot faster. I remember speaking with a colleague of mine at a conference in Singapore a few years ago, and I loved his insight around the importance of identifying those tides. Gary Hamel, if you haven't heard of him, great thinker, amazing author, and a professor at the London Business School, says this. He said, "You cannot outrun the future if you don't see it coming." And for us as an organization, for our clubs, we've got to be so tuned into where the world is heading so that we are with the times. We can't, I mean, sadly, as clubs, we've often talked about just trying to catch up. Hey, how do we try and make sure we're half a step ahead of where the world's heading? That's the opportunity we've got right now as an organization in the face of this crisis. And now, if you look at the sort of trends that this crisis has accelerated, these are the big 6 ones. And if we have time, we might come back during the Q&A at the end to talk about some of these trends, because this is the landscape we've got to be paying attention to. These are the 6 big trends or disruptions that we've seen really ramp up over the last few months. And the genie is not going back in the bottle. And so if you look at this ubiquitous artificial intelligence, particularly the influence of facial recognition technology, that has accelerated rapidly in the last few months. Democratized distribution, a fancy way for talking about rethinking supply chains, manufacturing. A big one to watch will be the influence of 3D printing. We've seen that really come to the fore over the last few months. Workforce redesign, the fact that we're doing things like this, these sort of Zoom calls. I mean, this is reshaping the entire way that organizations and workplaces will run. And I was chatting with a colleague this morning, and I think, you know, what's interesting is those of you based in regional areas, and based on this district and where the district's boundaries are, a lot of you are in regional hubs. I actually think this crisis will be a gift to regional Australia. We're going to see a lot of people in the next 5 years say, you know what, I can work in Orange, I can work in Mudgee, I can work in Albury, and actually work in the city, but live in those areas where the quality of life is a whole stack better. It's less expensive to live and raise a family, but I can actually dial in and still work in Melbourne or Sydney or Canberra. I think we're going to see this change, you know, a really significant one over the next few years. And I think it's going to also influence the way our clubs work. I mean, for my own club, our plan right now is once this crisis finishes, we will still have 2 meetings a month on Zoom. 2 meetings face-to-face, 2 meetings on Zoom. I think that is sort of reflective of what we're going to see happen in the workplace as well. Automated mobility is an interesting one. I mean, we could spend a whole stack of time talking about that. I mean, driverless cars have been on the radar for a lot of us for a while. Certainly from my perspective, watching the developments in the driverless car space. What's been interesting in this crisis, we've seen contactless or humanless delivery. So delivery vehicles that are completely autonomous have been used at many of the hospitals overseas. And week by week, we are building up thousands of hours of testing of driverless delivery vehicles. So after this crisis, this will be something that stays with us. Digitized commerce, and we touched on this before, the fact that, you know, right now what we're seeing is the death of cash. I mean, most businesses now, you can't even use cash because of the health risks. Everything's tap and go. I think after this, we will see the demise of cash accelerated by probably 10 years. You know, it would have otherwise taken 10 years for physical cash to disappear. This is going to see it probably disappear in the next 12 months, okay? And the last one I wanted to touch on briefly, because I think it's so important for us and our clubs, is the lure of local. This was already growing over the last few years, but I think what we've seen because of this crisis is everyone is thinking a whole lot more local community, local businesses, local produce. It has really put a spotlight on that. And this is where I think the opportunity is for our clubs. In fact, I was reading an article yesterday talking about the lockdowns happening in Melbourne. And it was a really interesting article in the Sydney Morning Herald on The Age, because they were talking about how the community is now gathering together online using Facebook to support each other. And this was one of the examples given in the article, which I thought was a really good one. It's called the North Melbourne Good Karma Network. And if you get a chance to look at this online, this is a great example of where, because of the lockdown, the community is getting together to say, how do we support each other, look out for each other? How do we make sure that we have a really clear sense of what it means to belong to our community? If you need help picking up groceries, if you've got issues in your home, if you need something changed in a light globe, how do we put it on a Facebook group so everyone can jump in and help each other? Super local. And I think this is where Rotary clubs actually have a huge opportunity, because in many cases, a Rotary club can be an amazing hub for bringing together lots of different parts of the community to help. This is our chance. People are now thinking local. They're going online in ways they hadn't before. How do we make sure our clubs' Facebook groups, our clubs' websites are the places that are essentially a way to facilitate that local connection? As we think about this whole notion of how do we use this time of change to adapt well, I love this insight from Winston Churchill. And apparently some are saying that this is not actually his quote, but even if it isn't, it's the sort of thing I suspect he would have said or agreed with. And Winston Churchill is purported to say, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And you know what? The reality is the world is changing so rapidly right now. This is our opportunity as clubs to tap into some of those trends and not lag the trends as clubs, but actually be at the cutting edge. This is our opportunity, particularly around that local connection. It's what we do best, and we've done it that way for decades. All right, number 4, the fourth and final key if we're going to kickstart well after this crisis is we need to think momentum, not motivation. And there's a big difference between those two things. Now, I want to have a bit of fun with you for a moment. I want to have a quick game. And this is a little game that I'm going to call, Were You Paying Attention? Okay, in a few seconds, I want to take you all back to high school science class, which is where most of us first learn about the dynamics of momentum. High school science class, okay? Here's the question I want to ask you. And I want to see how many of you were actually paying attention in class. Okay, the question is this one here. What is Newton's first law of motion also commonly known as? Okay, is it A, the law of inversion? Is it B, the law of immersion? Is it C, the law of inertia? Or is it D, the law of implosion? A, B, C, or D? Maybe just pop into the chat function there on Zoom. A, B, C, or D. I'll give you a 10-second countdown. Which of these four is it? A, B, C, or D? We'll see you as paying attention in class here. All right, looks like a number of you got it right. Lots of you, in fact. So the correct answer is C, the law of inertia. Well done, for those of you who were paying attention in class, okay? What does the law of inertia tell us, though? It tells us this: the hardest thing to do is get off go. It takes the most energy to get moving, to break the shackles of inertia. And once you're moving, it's actually much easier to speed up. And right now, for many of our clubs, this is a challenge we face. Even if we've gone to online meetings, there is that sense in which the world has stopped for Rotary. We've or if we haven't stopped, we've slowed right down. And so as we exit this crisis, the challenge is, how do we break those shackles of inertia? How do we get things moving again? What I'm seeing in the business world, and certainly in some cases in the Rotary world, is we're thinking, okay, we've got to G people up and motivate and inspire them. And I think there's a place for that. But I would suggest, if you want to get your club moving again, the best thing to do, rather than just focusing on motivation, is focus on momentum. How do you get people off go? Give people a sense of, as a club, some quick wins, getting back in the saddle. Now, because why success breeds success, okay? But it breaks inertia like nothing else will. Now, any of you who are familiar with some of the business literature would be familiar with this term here, the notion of a BHAG. Now, a BHAG it's a very awkward, inelegant sort of acronym. It stands for a big, hairy, audacious goal. And the idea is, if you want to really spark enthusiasm in a business, you've got to have a goal that's so big and so audacious and so exciting that people are just drawn to it. And big, hairy, audacious goals are great. But I want to put it to you that when it comes to sparking momentum, what we need is not big, hairy, audacious goals. I learned this from a leadership expert in the US named Craig Groeschel. He said this: we don't need big, hairy, audacious goals to build momentum. We need S-bags, not BHAGs, S-bags. What's an S-bag? A stretching but achievable goal. Right now for our clubs, we've got to set just 2 or 3 goals, things we can do in the next couple of weeks just to get us off go. Because once we're moving, we've got a sense that actually change is possible. Reminding what it feels like to be in motion and doing things and having a win, that's when motivation starts to follow. I love this insight from a great book I read last year called Atomic Habits. And in that book, James Clear put it well when he said this: he said the most effective form of motivation is progress. A sense that things are moving, that things are progressing. That's where the motivation really comes from. So how do we do that in our clubs? How do we get off go? That's where the game is going to be at over the next few weeks, the next few months, as we try and come out of this crisis well. All right, we are almost out of time. I want to have a few minutes for Q&A at the end. Before we do that though, what I will do is I'll put my details up on the screen. Feel free to have a look at the website. There's a whole pile of things up there that could be useful. There's a whole video channel, for instance, on the website with just short clips that build on some of the things that we've talked about in this session. So feel free to have a look at the website. Another thing in case it will be helpful, I mean, we only talked really briefly about some of those trends that are coming down the line. As I said, we could spend a lot more time going deep into some of that stuff. If you want to go a little bit deeper, looking at some of the trends that will shape the next few years, the ones we've really got to be paying attention to, we put a piece of research out a little while back called the top, towards 2030, which is sort of the top 8 big trends that will shape the next decade for all of us, but particularly in our clubs. But society and industries also, what are the things we've got to make sure are on the radar? So if you want to have a look at that report, even get a copy of that, just to be able to share with perhaps other colleagues at work or in your club, just to get a sense of what's the future going to hold. The best way to get a hold of that report, if you go onto my website, so it's michaelmcqueen.net, on the homepage, you'll see a little blue button that says conference code. And if you click on that blue button, it'll ask for your first name, the best email address for us to send that report to as a download link. I think it comes as like a Dropbox or a OneDrive type link, and it'll ask for a code. So the code for this event, for this discussion, is the code word trends. If you put the word trends in, it'll flick a note to you with a download link for that report as a PDF. So feel free to have a look at that if that would be of help. Now, we'll wrap up in a few moments, but I guess what I want to be really mindful of is, as we're talking about the whole post-crisis world, not to make light of just how massive this has been. I mean, as a crisis, as a time, this has been huge. I mean, I think of some of my colleagues, particularly those in the travel industry, and there are others, but I mean, the travel industry has just been smashed by this. I mean, this has been It's been devastating for some people. There's just no way around that. And so I don't want to make light of that. But the reality is we're at a point right now where now we can't change what has happened. And for some of us, what the next few months will hold as we continue in lockdowns. And we can't change that. At this stage, all we can really do is change what happens next, change what this crisis will mean for us individually and for our clubs when we look back on it in 10 years' time. And the encouraging thing I'll give you is simply this: only you get to write that story. You know, the clubs and the organizations that are flourishing in 10 years' time, many of them will be flourishing because they'll look back at this time period and look at what they did, the sort of innovation that it sparked, and they go, you know what, that crisis was tough, but I'm so glad it happened. Otherwise, we would never have done this, this, and this, and now that's been key to our success today. I guess that's the challenge for all of us, is how do we use this time well? I'm going to leave you with this great insight from a guy named Andy Grove, who used to be the CEO, the head of Intel. And Andy Grove has some great insights into business. He only passed away a few years ago. And I love this insight here. He said, you know what, some companies, and you could substitute clubs in here, or businesses, or individuals, okay? But he said, some companies are destroyed by crisis. There'll be some clubs, some Rotary clubs that don't last out in the next 6 months because of this crisis. They won't know what to do and they'll fold. That's just going to be a sad reality. Same for businesses. But he said, some companies are destroyed by crisis. Others merely survive them. He said, but great companies are always improved by them. And that's my sincere hope, is that some of what we've talked about tonight will give you some tips and insights into how to not just get through this crisis as a club or as an individual or in your business, but actually come out the other side of this stronger, improved as a result of it. So again, thank you for having me. I hope that was helpful. What I'm going to do now is just pass back to, I'm not sure whether Judy or Mary, just to open up for Q&A. We've only got a couple of minutes, so any questions or points for clarification from what we've discussed tonight?
Thanks, Michael. Thank you for what was just an amazing presentation. I think everybody got something out of it, and I certainly did. And not just for clubs. There are people listening to this that aren't necessarily members of Rotary, but I'm sure they will have got so much out of it for their own businesses. So I will now pass over to Mary. I don't think we've got enough time for any questions and answers. There aren't too many up there. So pass over to Mary to close the meeting. You're on mute.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks, Michael. I'm looking at all the chat questions, comments, and it's just amazing what's coming through, Michael. People are really noticing that this is now the time to do something. It's not just in our Rotary clubs, but also in many, many businesses. And I work in many businesses as well. So thank you very much, Michael, for that. You've certainly challenged us to think differently, both at our club level and our business level. As people are saying, Michael, no wonder you're such a recognized speaker. You present really well, and your ideas are absolutely fantastic and very challenging, I must say, to many, many people. But thank you for that, Michael.
My pleasure. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Now, I must also remind everybody, just as we close tonight, that this is the very first of these forums that Judy and I have organised. As I said to some of you that are beyond our district, welcome to District 9705. This is what we're now doing in our district. We're doing things differently, so it's all very, very exciting. So our very next forum will be run by Kero O'Shea, and Kero is actually on here tonight. Now, the next meeting will be on August the 13th. Put it in your diaries, everyone. And it'll be between 5:30 and 6:30 once again. And it will be a similar forum as tonight. So Kero O'Shea, he'll be talking about how to do things differently in your club. So it'll be following on from the same theme as Michael tonight. So once again, thanks everyone for coming on board. Thanks to our IT guru, Paul Murray, who's always in the background. And thanks to my co-chair, Judy Ford. Thanks everyone. Fantastic to see so many people on board. Welcome to District 9705. Thanks everyone.